Hello, welcome to another scary story that you can fall asleep to. The air changed 3 miles before the cabin, dropping 15 degrees and taking on the thick metallic scent of snow and damp decay. Elias Thorne gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the aged plastic, and squinted through the windshield. The old blazer he'd bought specifically for this trip affectionately and pessimistically nicknamed the Coffin, rattled like a loose skeleton over the deeply rutted gravel track. Elias was a writer of horror, but a skeptic in life. He'd come to the Blackwood cabin not for ghosts, but for silence, for the oppressive, perfect quiet needed to hammer out the final, difficult chapters of his new novel. The listing had promised seclusion, and after 2 hours of driving past the last faint cell tower signal and into a forest so dense it seemed to swallow the afternoon light whole, Elias felt assured he had found it. The trees here weren't the friendly, vibrant green kind. They were impossibly tall, skeletal pines draped in heavy, silent moss, their lower branches creating a perpetual, damp gloom. They didn't just stand, they loomed. When he finally saw it, the Blackwood cabin was exactly as the photos had depicted, an architectural apology carved from dark, unpainted timber. It wasn't picturesque. It was ancient and slumped, built with logs that looked less harvested and more surrendered. A single soot-stained chimney leaned precariously against the sky. No smoke rose from it, of course. No one had been here for months, maybe years, except the absentee landlord who'd mailed the rusted key. Elias killed the engine. The resulting silence was less a lack of sound and more a physical presence, a dense, palpable weight that pressed against his eardrums. He sat for a moment, letting the exhaustion of the 7-hour drive settle, and then reached for the ignition to start the internal combustion engine again, only to realize his hand was hovering. It's just a cabin, Elias. Stop trying to write the opening scene. He forced himself out. The air was frigid, instantly finding its way beneath his thick wool sweater. As he dragged his suitcase from the back seat, his boot scuffed something hidden beneath a drift of pine needles. He nudged it aside with his toe. It was a perfectly smoothed river stone, though they were miles from any running water. It felt unnaturally cold, even through the leather of his boot. He ignored it. Writer's overactive imagination. The key was a monstrous piece of ironwork, heavy and ornately detailed. It scraped harshly against the lock plate of the front door, the sound echoing in the unnerving quiet. The door gave way with a mournful drawn, outgrown, revealing an interior swallowed by shadows. The cabin consisted of a single great room with a lofted bedroom above. Dust lay everywhere, thick and undisturbed, muffling the floorboards. But it wasn't the dust that caught his attention. It was the temperature. Outside was freezing, but inside, the air was utterly dead, a vacuum of warmth, yet without the sharpness of natural cold. It felt like being immersed in a tank of still, deep lake water. Elias moved to the fireplace, dropping his bag. He could see the faint outline of a square of lighter wood on the hearth, where the old occupants must have kept their firewood pile. He walked over and ran a hand over the stone mantel. The silence was still there, but now it felt different, like it was listening. He took a deep breath, fighting the irrational urge to leave the door open. He spun around, surveying the room. A rickety table, a few mismatched chairs, and the staircase leading up to the loft. Nothing remarkable. Yet there was the scent. Not mildew, not rot, but something far more subtle and disturbing. Iron and ozone, like the aftermath of a lightning strike, mixed with a faint, cloying sweetness. He decided the first order of business was light. He found the breaker box near the kitchen alcove. The main switch was thrown to off. He flipped it on. A fluorescent light fixture above the small counter blinked violently twice, buzzing loudly before dying completely. plunging the kitchen into deeper gloom. Great. He'd have to rely on the oil lamp he'd brought and the battery-powered lantern. As he turned to retrieve them from his bag, he noticed something in the far corner, near a dark, sealed closet he hadn't registered before. It was a scratch mark on the wooden floorboard. Not a superficial scuff, but a deep, ugly gouge, as if something heavy with sharp edges had been dragged with tremendous force across the wood. It began at the closet door and trailed maybe 6 feet toward the center of the room before stopping abruptly, as if the object had simply lifted into the air. He knelt, tracing the mark with a skeptical finger. It was old, layered with dust and grime, but undeniably deep. It was the mark of violence, or at least of great struggle. He stood up, his writer's curiosity suddenly battling his hardened skepticism. He took a single, deliberate step toward the closet. The silence in the cabin intensified, the metallic ozone scent growing sharper. As he reached out for the knob, a distinct sound broke the oppressive quiet, a soft, almost inaudible thud from the loft above him. It sounded exactly like a piece of furniture had been gently, but firmly set down onto the dusty wooden floor. Elias froze, his hand inches from the closet door. He was alone. He knew he was alone. The key had been mailed directly to him, and the nearest neighbor was 10 miles back down the rutted track. He looked up at the dark maw of the loft. "Hello." His voice sounded reedy and thin, instantly consumed by the thick air. No response, just the silence, now feeling less like a weight and more like an attentive predator. He was a writer. He was supposed to crave this. This was the exact kind of creeping dread he spent months trying to manufacture for his readers. He should be thrilled. Instead, a primitive, cold certainty settled in his stomach, overriding the years of rational thought. Whatever had just happened upstairs was not the wind, not settling wood, and certainly not the kind of thing he would ever put in a book. It was real, and it was waiting for him to climb the stairs. Elias Thorne felt the fear not as a burst of adrenaline, but as an instantaneous, profound physical subtraction. His blood went cold, his lungs seized, and the primitive part of his brain, the part that writes horror only to suppress it, screamed a single, desperate command: flee. But the writer, the rationalist, the skeptic, was still clinging to the wheel. "Hello." He tried again, louder this time, pitching his voice up to the dark timber of the loft. "Is anyone there? I'm the new renter." The silence that followed was total. It wasn't the natural silence of the deep woods. It was the manufactured silence of something holding its breath, waiting to be addressed. It felt patient. He dropped his suitcase where it was, near the dead fireplace, and fumbled in his canvas gear bag. He pulled out the heavy, battery-powered lantern, the one designed for camping trips where you needed to signal a helicopter. He switched it on. A harsh, sickly yellow light sliced through the ambient gloom, making the shadows writhe and retreat only to reform into sharper, more menacing shapes. The staircase was steep, narrow, and uncarpeted, a ladder masquerading as a stairway. The wood looked dark and rotten, worn concave in the middle of each step. Elias put his foot on the first riser. The wood protested with a loud, tearing creak that seemed to betray his presence to the entire silent forest outside. He climbed slowly, the lantern held high, its beam sweeping back and forth like a nervous sentinel. Every ascent of his heavy boot was met with a deeper, more profound groan from the structure. He wasn't just climbing stairs. He was ascending into the very source of the cabin's illness. It was the house settling, Elias, thermal contraction. Dust falling off a shelf, he fed himself the lines, the comforting banality he sold in his novels. But the metallic ozone scent grew stronger with every step, sharp and sickeningly sweet. He reached the landing. The loft was a single, claustrophobic space, tucked under the peaked roof. The ceiling sloped sharply, forcing him to duck his head beneath the dusty rafters. A single, high window, no larger than a bread box, was painted shut with layers of black, peeling paint. In the center was a simple iron bed frame with a flattened, stained mattress. A small, three-drawer dresser stood against the far wall. Everything was covered in a deep, undisturbed mantle of gray dust. It draped over the dresser knobs and coated the iron bedposts, a thick, uniform layer that spoke of years of neglect. He could have written his name on any surface with his fingertip, and yet there it was. His harsh lantern beam, scanning the floorboards, froze. Right in the middle of the room, near the foot of the empty bed, was an impossible sight. A 4-foot square section of the floor had been wiped clean. The dusty, gray veneer was gone, exposing the dark, aged timber beneath. It was a perfect, pristine square, surrounded by the untouched film of years. It was as if someone had taken a wet cloth and wiped the spot with furious purpose, then meticulously replaced the rag without disturbing a single surrounding particle. And in the exact center of this impossibly clean patch rested the source of the sound, a single black wooden block. Elias lowered the lantern, kneeling in the dust beside the clean area. The block was roughly the size of a small cinder block, perhaps 10 inches cubed, cut from a wood darker than the floorboards. It looked newly cut, lacking the aging and grime that covered everything else. He reached out and touched it. It was unnaturally cold, colder than the river stone he'd found outside, colder than the air in the cabin, feeling almost wet to the touch. It had density, weight. It was solid, immovable. It hadn't fallen. It had been placed. He ran his fingers over the perimeter of the clean square. The edge was sharp, a distinct line dividing the disturbed from the undisturbed. Whatever had cleaned this spot had done it with a mechanical, obsessive precision, like wiping a square from a canvas without smudging the paint. This was no animal. This was no settling house. This was the moment the floor dropped out from under his skepticism. He stood up, clutching the lantern, his gaze sweeping frantically around the small room. The thought hit him. If something had placed this block, it must still be here. He checked behind the dresser, lifting the sagging mattress, throwing the beam into every dark corner. Nothing, just the dust, the stale air, and the unnerving, listening silence. He backed up toward the stairs, never taking his eyes off the strange black cube resting on the clean wood. The metallic scent was now so intense it made his eyes water. He had to get out. The novel, the silence, the seclusion, it was all worthless compared to the primal imperative to retreat from this place. He took his final step back, his heel nudging the top riser of the staircase. He planted his foot down, ready to descend and bolt for the car. And that's when the sound came from below. It was a low, guttural scrape, not loud, but utterly unmistakable. It came from the main floor, and it was not the sound of wind or wood settling. It was the sound of something heavy dragging slowly across the floorboards, not the old, violent scratch he'd noticed earlier near the kitchen, but a wet, viscous sound, like gristle being dragged over splintered timber. And it was coming from directly behind the dark, sealed closet near the kitchen alcove, the closet he had been about to open just moments before the first sound from the loft had interrupted him. Elias froze on the top step, the rough wood digging into his heel. The yellow beam of the lantern trembled in his hand. He was trapped between the impossible geometry of the loft and the menacing darkness of the main floor. The cabin hadn't just made a noise. It had orchestrated a maneuver, moving him from one threat to another. The scraping stopped. The silence rushed back in, thicker and more demanding than before. Elias felt the air grow impossibly heavy, the weight of the wood pressing in, waiting for him to make his next move. The cabin was a cage, and he was cornered. Elias was caught in the worst kind of horror, the kind where the danger is ambiguous, but the threat is absolute. The cold, logical part of him was already constructing hypotheses. A squirrel, a collapsing shelf, a prank played by the landlord, but the cold physical reality of the clean square and the perfectly placed black block negated every rational excuse. And now the scraping from below felt like a sentence being passed. He had to get down. The loft was a snare. The way out was at the bottom. He gripped the wooden railing, more of a guide rail than a support, and forced himself to move, careful not to look down the yawning black well of the stairwell. The lantern beam, still clutched in his trembling hand, swept the main floor. The light was insufficient, its yellow halo creating more terrifying shapes than it dispelled. He started his descent backward, pressing himself against the wall, taking exaggeratedly slow steps. Each creak from the stairs was agonizing, a drumbeat marking his passage. Scrape. The sound came again, slightly louder this time, less viscous and more abrasive. It was definitely moving toward the center of the cabin, away from the kitchen alcove and the sealed closet. It sounded like something heavy and angular being dragged by a short, powerful, uneven pull. He reached the fifth step from the bottom. Just a few feet separated him from the main floor. He paused, squinting. The scraping had stopped directly beneath the stairs, hidden in the cone of shadow where the lantern couldn't penetrate. "Show yourself," Elias whispered, the bravado a pathetic veneer over his racing heart. He knew, with sudden certainty, that whatever was down there was not going to follow a script. He jumped the last 3 steps, landing softly, rolling slightly on the balls of his feet. He felt a spike of pain in his knee, but the immediate necessity of movement overrode it. He spun, swinging the lantern beam in a wide, frantic arc. The light landed on the corner, illuminating the sealed closet and the kitchen alcove. He saw the table, the chairs, his discarded luggage by the hearth. Everything was exactly where it should be, except for the floor, where the scraping had been. The floorboards were now glistening, not with water, but with a streak of something dark, thick, and profoundly wrong. It wasn't the uniform, aged dark of the timber. It was a fresh, sticky blackness that mirrored the unnaturally clean square upstairs. It started at the dark, sealed closet near the old violent gouge mark he'd noted earlier, and dragged across the room. He walked toward it, his skepticism officially dead, replaced by a cold, clinical horror that only a writer could appreciate. He knelt beside the stain, bringing the lantern close. It looked like crude oil, but it smelled like the intensified metallic ozone he detected earlier, like blood mixed with battery acid and something ancient. As he looked closer, he saw that the liquid wasn't just on the wood. It seemed to be seeping from the wood itself, as if the aged timber of the cabin were sweating a dark industrial ichor. He followed the trail with his eyes. It led straight to the front door, the heavy one secured by the iron key. The trail stopped a foot short of the threshold, where a new identical object rested on the dark wood, a second, black wooden block. It was exactly the same size, texture, and coldness as the one upstairs. It looked like a twin cut from the same impossibly dark, dense timber. The first block had been placed in a clean square upstairs. This second block had been dragged from the sealed closet, leaving a residue of the cabin's strange black bile. The scraping noise wasn't the sound of an intruder dragging an object. It was the sound of the cabin itself, moving an object into place. Elias felt a wave of nausea, the scent of ozone and iron overwhelming him. The blocks were markers, pieces on a board, and the cabin was the player. He realized what the arrangement meant. One block was at the foot of the bed, the place of rest. The other was at the front door, the place of escape. They stood like grotesque, silent sentinels. As he stared at the block near the door, a faint but distinct scratching began. It wasn't the heavy drag of the last sound. This was light, rapid, and frantic, like a rat trapped inside a wall. It was coming from the dark, sealed closet near the kitchen alcove, the closet where the stain originated. Elias knew he should run. He should grab his keys, ignore the blocks, and sprint back to the blazer. But the writers need to know, to see the final scene. Had him trapped. He felt a dreadful pull toward the closet, drawn by the desperate scratching. The closet door had no knob, only a thick, rusting steel bolt driven through the wood, securing the two sides of the door together. It looked like a clumsy, permanent repair. He approached cautiously, raising the lantern. The scratching intensified, becoming more frantic, punctuated by wet, muffled thuds, as if whatever was inside was throwing itself against the thin timber. This is it, Elias. This is the moment you see the monster. He forced his hand out and placed it on the cold, solid wood of the closet door. It vibrated violently beneath his palm, and the scratching changed, moving away from his hand and concentrating higher up near the top corner of the frame. He could feel a faint draft escaping the seam of the door, carrying with it the sickeningly sweet odor of ozone and old decay, now mixed with something sharper, something undeniably animal. Then, from the gap in the top corner of the closet door, a small white sliver appeared. It was a shard of bone, unnaturally sharp and polished smooth, forcing its way out of the tiny seam. It scraped against the door jamb, leaving a faint white streak in the dark wood. Elias instinctively recoiled, stumbling back against a rickety kitchen table. The table shuddered, and a stack of old water, damaged magazines slid off the edge and hit the floor with a hollow thwump. The closet went instantly, completely silent. The white bone shard remained lodged in the door jamb, a tiny, horrifying punctuation mark. Elias stood frozen, heart hammering against his ribs, staring at the bone. He knew he had to move now. He had seconds. He scrambled back toward the front door, tripping over the small, cold black block that stood guard. He kicked it aside. The block didn't tumble, it slid, heavy as iron, and stopped neatly against the wall. He reached the front door, his hand shaking so violently. He couldn't get the monstrous iron key into the rusted lock. He had to escape. He had to. Just then, a voice, faint and thin, like dry leaves, skittering across pavement, whispered from the shadows of the sealed closet. Elias, the whispered word. Elias was softer than a breath, yet it struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was the sound of recognition in a place that should have known only silence. It wasn't accusatory or threatening, but intimate, possessive, the way a person names something they own. For one agonizing moment, Elias forgot the key, the door, and the vital need to move. He stared wide-eyed at the sliver of white bone wedged in the closet door jamb, the impossible source of the sound. The bone shard pulsed faintly in the lantern light, reflecting his terror back at him. Then the survival mechanism kicked in, raw and violent. Run! He fumbled for the iron key still dangling from the lock plate. His hand was slick with sweat, his fingers numb. He managed to grab the heavy head of the key and jammed it into the deadbolt. It slid home with a sickening clunk. He twisted, putting his entire weight into the motion, expecting the satisfying thud of the bolt retracting. Nothing. The key turned a quarter, inch and locked solid. It resisted his effort not with the stiffness of rust, but with the immovable certainty of a mechanical failure. He pulled the key out, reversed it, and tried again, wrenching it clockwise and counterclockwise until his palm was raw. The lock refused to yield. No, 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 he grunted, slamming the key against the iron plate, then forcing it back into the slot. He twisted one last time, putting his shoulder against the timber door as he strained. The key remained unmoving. From the sealed closet, the voice came again, slightly louder, closer, and tinged with a faint, dry amusement. The writer must finish his work, Elias. You crave the silence. The silence craves the structure. Elias stumbled backward, abandoning the useless key. He looked down at the floor, where the second black block, the one guarding the escape route, now rested. It had slid neatly back into position, flush against the doorframe, completing the invisible perimeter the cabin had drawn around him. He raised the heavy lantern and hurled it with desperate strength at the nearest window. The lantern hit the small, dusty pane with a sharp crack, thud, a sound that should have been shattering. But the glass, thick and ancient, only shuddered violently, throwing the lantern back onto the dusty floor near the hearth. The light didn't shatter. It went out instantly and completely, leaving the cabin plunged into an absolute suffocating darkness. The darkness was not empty. It was filled with the iron and ozone scent and a profound, ambient cold that seemed to sink into his bones. The air was loud with the sound of his own ragged breathing. He was blind, trapped, and standing in the spilled residue of the cabin's dark sweat. His hands shot out, blindly patting the dusty wood of the table and the cold metal of the chair legs until he found the large, reassuring shape of his canvas gear bag. He scrabbled through it, past his laptop, past his food rations, until his hand closed around the small, single-wick oil lamp he had packed. He had matches in his pocket. He retreated to the stone hearth, finding a spot next to the dead fireplace. He knelt, fighting the urge to sob, and fumbled for his matches. His hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries, but finally, the abrasive head caught fire, spitting a brief, brilliant sulfur flare. The flare died down to the weak, trembling flame of the lamp wick. The small, sickly orange glow pushed back the oppressive blackness, but only a few feet in any direction. It was a beacon that did more to define the surrounding darkness than to dispel it. In the faint light, Elias could see the extent of the ichor trail leading from the closet to the door. He could see the 2 black sentinel blocks, one at the door, one now dimly visible upstairs at the foot of the bed, and he saw that the deep, violent gouge near the closet, the mark he'd first dismissed as old damage, was now glistening black, filled with the same foul liquid that trailed across the floor. The scratching started again, softer this time, but persistent, and mixed with a faint sound of dry, rustling movement within the sealed space. Then the voice, clearer now, less a whisper and more a dry rasp, emanated not just from the closet, but seemed to come from the very timber of the hearth he was crouched beside. "The pages are cold, Elias. We need the fire." Elias looked up. The large, soot-stained mouth of the chimney yawned above him. He had intended to use the fireplace to warm the cabin. Now, he felt a deeper, more chilling intent behind the voice's words. The pages are cold. He didn't want to know, but he had to. He reached into his gear bag, pulling out the object the voice was demanding. His manuscript, the near-complete draft of his horror novel, printed and bound with a simple black clip. The pages were heavy, pristine, and perfectly cold. The silence returned, waiting. The cabin demanded a sacrifice, and the only thing it wanted to burn was his work. The silence returned, but it was no longer the empty silence of the forest. It was the heavy, loaded silence of expectation. Elias knelt before the dead fireplace, the small, flickering flame of the oil lamp reflecting in his terrified eyes. The manuscript lay beside him, 300 pages of his most intimate thoughts, his meticulous plotting, his obsession with dread and isolation. It was his career, his livelihood, and the only proof that his last year hadn't been spent in a fugue state. "The pages are cold, Elias. We need the fire." The demand was absurd, yet terrifyingly simple. It wasn't asking for money, or blood, or a confession. It was asking for the destruction of the very thing that had brought him to the cabin. "Why?" Elias croaked, his voice strained and dry. He spoke not to the closet, but to the shadows in general, to the cold, oppressive atmosphere of the room. "What do you want with my work?" There was no verbal response, but the small oil lamp on the hearth began to flicker wildly, though there was no draft. Its flame elongated, twisting into a sharp needle, like spire before shrinking back to a stub. The movement was a clear, emphatic impatience. He glanced at the sealed closet. The white shard of bone was still wedged in the frame, but the dark ichor trail leading from the closet to the door now seemed to pulse faintly in the low light. The cabin was waiting. Elias clutched the manuscript. He had written about characters making impossible choices, about the terrible exchange of goods for survival. Now he was the one in the story. Was he willing to sacrifice his career to escape the monster he had, ironically, come here to write about? The truth was, the manuscript felt like a dead weight. The moment he had heard his name whispered and seen the second black block slide into place, the entire novel, with its tidy plots and rational horrors, had become meaningless. The terror in this cabin surpassed anything he could have invented. He took a deep, shuddering breath. If destroying the pages bought him a single moment of advantage, a chance to smash the window, a lull in the entity's attention, he would take it. With numb hands, he peeled back the black clip and separated the first 20 pages, the title page, the dedication, and the opening chapters that laid out the protagonist's arrival. He held the stack over the oil lamp. The thick paper caught quickly. The edges curled instantly into bright orange tendrils of flame, and the intense heat pushed back the ambient cold. As the pages burned, a startling change occurred in the cabin. The intense metallic ozone smell, the smell of the cabin's sickness, immediately began to recede, replaced by the clean, sharp scent of burning paper and wood smoke. The oppressive weight in the air eased slightly, and the darkness surrounding the oil lamp seemed to pull back an extra foot. The rustling in the closet stopped entirely. It was working. The fire was a distraction, an offering, a means of appeasement. Elias began to tear pages in clumps of 20, feeding them methodically into the lamp flame. The small wick could barely sustain the constant barrage of fuel, but the pages kept igniting, his words turning to smoke and ash. He watched his intricate world, building, the detailed backstories, the carefully constructed dialogue, vanish into a brief, furious blaze. The irony of burning his horror story to survive a real one was almost overwhelming enough to make him laugh. A short, hysterical bark that died quickly in his throat. He worked his way through the first 100 pages, the narrative melting away, the protagonist's descent into madness, the discovery of the diary, the hints of the creature in the woods, gone, gone. When he reached the middle section, the structural core of the novel, the entity offered its only feedback. A soft, low hum began to vibrate through the floorboards. It was a harmonic, resonant frequency, like a huge, invisible tuning fork being struck directly beneath the cabin. The sound was not threatening, but deeply satisfying, an audible sigh of contentment. The cabin seemed to be enjoying the meal. Encouraged, Elias tore away the next section, the major plot twist, the confrontation, the scene where the protagonist finally meets the beast. He threw them onto the fire. The flame surged with surprising power, leaping up the chimney mouth like a greedy tongue. The heat was now intense, driving the lingering cold from the hearth area. He had about 50 pages left. He saw the final chapter, the ambiguous, chilling ending he had spent weeks perfecting. As he reached for the remaining pages, the humming beneath the floorboards intensified. It began to take on a rhythm, a slow, deliberate thump, 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 thump. It sounded like a massive, heavy heart beating under the floor. Elias held the final sheaf of pages. He needed to be quick. He threw the last pages into the fireplace. The moment the final chapter caught fire, the beating stopped. The humming vanished. The cabin held its breath once more, and then the front door, the door with the jammed lock, gave a massive, shuddering thwap. Elias froze, looking from the dying embers of his life's work to the front door. The lock, which had refused to budge for his iron key, now slid open with a soft mechanical clack, as if released by an invisible hand. The front door, heavy and made of ancient timber, swung slowly inward on unoiled hinges, with a long drawn-out squeak. A blast of impossibly cold, night air rushed into the cabin, snuffing out the small oil lamp instantly. Elias was plunged back into the total, consuming darkness, colder and thicker than before. The fresh, earthy scent of the forest mixed violently with the residue of ozone and smoke. He had his window. The door was open. Freedom was less than 10 feet away. But the cold blast of air had also brought something else in with it. It was a sound, faint at first, then growing rapidly louder, the rhythmic, heavy, squelching sound of a massive, wet body being dragged across the dirt of the porch and onto the wooden threshold. It was coming in. Elias scrambled back, pressing himself against the cold stones of the hearth, desperately trying to regain his footing in the sudden, overwhelming blackness. The faint, high-pitched squeak of the closing door, pushed shut with tremendous, silent force, was the last sound he heard before the cabin sealed itself entirely once more. The final, soft squeak of the heavy front door sealing itself shut was the sound of the final, decisive lock clicking into place. Elias was back in the absolute blackness, but this time he was not alone. The air was thick with the forest's wet, cold breath, saturated with the metallic reek of ozone and a new profound stench of stagnant water and old meat. The rhythm of the squelching sound continued, a wet, heavy weight being hauled across the timber floor. Squelch, drag, pause. Squelch, drag, pause. Squelch, drag, pause. It was moving slow, but covering ground. It was moving toward the center of the room, toward the remnants of the oil lamp and the smoldering ash of his manuscript. Elias was huddled against the cold stones of the hearth, paralyzed by the realization that the door had not been opened for his escape, but for the thing's entrance. The burned manuscript had been the cost of the ticket for the entity from the woods. He forced his mind to focus. He couldn't see, but he could hear, and he could smell. The scraping was getting closer, moving past the kitchen alcove. He knew where the table was, where his gear bag lay, and where the fireplace tools rested. His hand searched blindly to his right, sweeping the cold stone of the hearth. His fingers brushed against something long and cold, the fire poker. He grasped the heavy iron shaft, the metal offering a sudden, immense, and completely inadequate sense of defense. It was clumsy, but it was solid. The squelching stopped. A deafening silence fell over the cabin, broken only by a shallow, bubbling hiss that seemed to originate from the center of the room, directly where the creature had last moved. It was the sound of heavy, wet breathing. The air pressure in the room felt different, tighter, as if the space itself was struggling to contain a volume that exceeded its capacity. Elias held his own breath, the iron poker raised high, ready to swing at nothing in the dark. He could feel the cold. It was no longer the drafty cold of the mountains, but an aggressive, bone-deep temperature drop, centered on the creature. Then, a sound like a wet leather glove being slapped heavily against wood. Slap. It hit the leg of the rickety kitchen table, just a few feet from where Elias crouched. The table rattled violently, sending a final solitary magazine sliding to the floor. Elias knew he had seconds before the creature located his heat and breathing. He needed to see. He needed 1 microsecond of visual information. Still kneeling, he dropped the poker, scrabbled in his trouser pocket, and found the box of matches. His hands, though still shaking, were fueled by a cold, desperate resolve. He tore a single match free, holding it between his thumb and forefinger. The hissing grew louder, moving slightly. The creature was leaning in, perhaps examining the sound of the rattling table. He struck the match against the box with a practiced, sharp movement. Fasak, the flare of sulfur and the immediate small blossom of orange light was blindingly bright against the total blackness. In the brief, 1 second flash of illumination, Elias saw it. It was impossibly huge, easily filling the space between the table and the hearth. It was not a creature of flesh and bone, but a mass of geometry and fluid motion. Its surface was a dull, oil-slick black, like the blocks in the floor ichor, but textured like tightly woven, wet rope or massive, wet pine bark that had been folded in on itself hundreds of times. It had no discernible head, limbs, or face, only a vast, heaving central mass that sat low to the ground. It seemed to have mass but no fixed shape. But what pinned Elias's gaze was its action. It was draped over the very spot where the manuscript had been burned, a thick, dark, wet tendril, too transient to be called a tentacle, retracted back into the main body. Where the tendril had touched the ash pile, a single, black wooden block was now forming, growing visibly from the scattered soot. The creature was feeding on his work and depositing the black, impossible objects. The match flame reached his fingers, burning him, and he instinctively dropped it. The light vanished. Elias was plunged back into the total, choking blackness. The horrifying vision burned onto his retina. He grabbed the iron poker again, its weight a comfort. The bubbling hiss was now directly in front of him. He could smell the sickeningly sweet, metallic rot inches away. He knew he couldn't see it, but the floor provided a clue. The heavy weight was now resting on the timber directly in front of the hearth. A soundless pressure, with a roar born of pure, animal panic and desperation. Elias swung the heavy iron poker horizontally, aiming for where the heart of the mass should be. The poker connected not with soft flesh, but with something sickeningly dense and pliable. The impact felt like striking a massive, cold, wet rubber tire packed with sand. The blow jarred his arm up to his shoulder, and the poker was instantly wrenched from his grasp by an immense unseen force. It didn't fly away, it was simply absorbed, and then a sound that transcended the noise of the squelching body or the dry whisper of the voice, a deep, profound thrumming. It wasn't the satisfied hum from the floorboards earlier. This was a sound of violent, immediate displeasure emanating from the black mass inches from his face. Elias scrambled blindly back, trying to reach the wall, but his feet caught on the uneven lip of the hearthstone. He fell backward, his head slamming against the solid rock of the fireplace. The last sensation he felt before the world went gray was the feeling of a heavy, damp, impossibly cold pressure settling over his chest, pinning him against the floor. The moment the massive cold pressure settled over Elias's chest, the world didn't simply go dark, it shattered. The impact against the hearthstone had dazed him, but the creature's weight was what extinguished the light of consciousness. The pressure was paralyzing, heavy, and wet, a massive blanket of negative temperature. He couldn't draw a breath, couldn't scream, and couldn't move, but the physical paralysis was immediately replaced by a horrifying hypersensory mental state. He wasn't seeing with his eyes, but with a different part of his mind, a part that was now being forced open, flooded with information, and then structured by the immense intelligence pressing down on him. He was no longer in the cabin. He was floating in a vast, cold expanse of pure, silent geometry. Everywhere he looked, massive, perfectly black, featureless cubes, identical to the ones on the cabin floor, floated in absolute stillness. They were organized into impossibly complex, silent structures, enormous lattices, towering scaffolds, and spiraling, inert columns that stretched into the mental darkness. This is the structure, a voice stated, echoing not in his ears, but in the deepest ventricle of his heart. It was the entity, but it sounded clearer, colder, and purely intellectual, like a theorem being proven. You sought the ultimate isolation to create structure, but isolation is our natural state. Elias tried to form a question, but his mind felt like a faulty machine, only capable of generating bursts of raw fear. What are you? We are the residue of the excluded, the things that did not fit in the narrative, the negative space in the canvas, the missing data point the voice articulated, the words instantly constructing perfect mental images of exclusion. You fed us words, Elias. You fed us your structure in exchange for a window of opportunity, and we deliver. The geometric vision shifted violently. The silent black architecture was replaced by a rapid-fire series of images, a visual history that slammed into Elias's awareness like a sequence of cold shocks. He saw the cabin, but it was new. The timber was bright pine, the scent of fresh-cut wood thick in the air. A man, a bearded, frantic man in rough-spun clothes, was meticulously sealing the loft door with dozens of small leaden blocks. He was locking something inside. His eyes were wide with terror, but also with profound relief. The first writer, he came seeking refuge from his own mind. He built a mental prison, and we were the thoughts he discarded, the ideas too terrible to be penned, the impurities of the plot. The scene shifted. The cabin was older now, the wood dark with age. Another occupant, a young woman, a cartographer, obsessed with drawing the perfect map of the surrounding mountains. But every time she completed a section, the reality of the map changed. A stream vanished, a trail appeared, a peak shifted. Elias watched her break down, weeping, as she meticulously burned her finished charts in the fireplace, replacing them with new ones, desperately trying to reconcile her rigid structure with a fluid, terrifying reality. She offered us accuracy. The cost was her memory. Every map she destroyed took a piece of her history, creating a perfect blank space for us to inhabit. The vision accelerated into a montage of suffering, each scene centered on the same process, a human being seeking ultimate order and offering the excess, the part that didn't fit their constructed reality, to the cabin. A philosopher burning his treatise on determinism, a mathematician destroying the equation that proved chaos. They all came here to impose a rigid structure on their lives or their art, and the cabin consumed the parts of their work that were incompatible with pure, elemental chaos. Your manuscript was about control, Elias. You chose the ending. You chose the monster. But we are the random event, the unwritten page, the thing that refuses the narrative. The vision snapped back to the present. Elias felt the massive wet pressure on his chest, but now it was different. It was less like a weight and more like an intense siphon. He felt his memories, particularly the memories of the last year he spent writing, being selectively drained. Not removed, but categorized and filed away, tagged with the silent, judgmental label, structure. The pressure eased just enough for him to gasp a ragged breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. The entity's voice was close, physical, a dry rasp against his ear that resonated with the sound of thousands of tiny pieces of grit rubbing together. You burned the words. Good. Now, you will give us the paper trail. The immense weight lifted from his chest. Elias's eyes snapped open in the total darkness. He lay sweating and shaking on the cold stone floor, the lingering, metallic stink heavy in his nostrils. The creature had moved, but it was still near. He heard the scraping sound again, but this time it was sharp, precise, and fast. The creature was using its immense body to scour the area around the hearth. Then he heard the faint shing of metal on stone. The creature had found his gear bag. It was moving something metallic and delicate. Elias's heart seized. His laptop. The creature was interested in the digital copy of the manuscript, the last existing record of his work. A loud, decisive snap echoed in the darkness, followed by the soft rhythmic click of keys being pressed. The creature was opening the laptop, and it was typing.